Well, we have not a lot of time, so let's jump right in. And as usual, I want to start with a little bit of definition. We've called today's episode The End of Enlightenment, but we also discussed calling it the end of reality, the end of truth, perhaps even the end of liberalism. So before we discuss the argument that you lay out in your book, can you just very, very briefly tell us what do you mean when you say enlightenment?
Yes, that's a very easy question. No, actually it isn't. That's very complicated. Of course, you have full libraries trying to discuss this. Here's what I suggest as a basic framework that can get us started. The Enlightenment is a project essentially to organize society around what you believe to be the truth, political truth. Now, this is actually a very revolutionary idea because one could argue before the 17th, 18th century, no philosopher, no political thinker actually thought that society could be organized on the grounds of what one understood to be the truth. If you go back to Plato and Aristotle, they thought that the truth belonged to philosophers that live in some respects separate and isolated from the political community. It's really modern European society that comes up with the revolutionary idea that you can bring truth down from the heavens into the city. There's a quoting from Plato. So what Plato thought was really a mad project of trying to make politics and truth coincide becomes second nature for Europeans over the past few centuries. And I think that's still how we think about it. We want our societies to be organized according to the truth. And today, when we turn to Donald Trump and to what is happening in America, we actually ask that question, and we are surprised, puzzled, in many cases, revolted that America seems to be doing the opposite of that.
All right, so I think you already started going a little bit into the argument. So let's explore this a little bit. The argument, if I have read and understood it correctly in your book, is essentially that the US is becoming a fundamentally new civilization, which is not based on what you refer to as the Enlightenment principle, if you want, or what we, I guess, sometimes refer to as sort of the Western or European liberalism. So can you expand a little bit on what the pillars of this new civilization are or could be, and then of course what the signs are of its emergence that you think we're already seeing now? I guess you mentioned one of them, Trump, already, but there are others.
Yes, so what I try to do in the book is actually to look at America and rather than deplore, rather instinctively what is happening there, try to make sense of it. And the premise there is that a country the size of America, and with also its wealth of historical experience and reflection, doesn't just go insane overnight. What is happening there has a meaning, has a historical meaning. And a significance that we should try to explore rather than immediately deplore. And I do that on Twitter all the time, sometimes with mixed success, as people might conclude that I'm defending Trump's administration or something of the sort. I'm trying to understand what is happening there. And it seems to me that this Enlightenment idea, of course, has been criticized on many grounds. But what seems to be happening today in America is actually that you have a new understanding of freedom, where freedom and facts, or freedom and reality, or freedom and truth are understood as being in contradiction or in conflict, which for Enlightenment thinkers in Europe would not have made sense. But if you start thinking about it, if human freedom is really embraced as the only value we have, the only thing we believe in, the only positive value to embrace, then why should it be limited by reality or by truth or by facts? Why shouldn't we attempt to live in what would be described as a fantasy life? Why shouldn't we pursue our desires independently of the truth and of reality? And I think, we'll talk about it over the next half hour or an hour. I think that helps explain a lot of what is happening in America today. This very vivid sense that even reality should not be a limit for human freedom. And that, in a way, one could describe as a post-Enlightenment idea, because breaking as it does with the project of making truth and politics coincide that we talked about, it still pursues it to its limit and in a way overcomes it. because the Enlightenment already wanted to get rid of many obstacles to human freedom. And then the one that is left is, well, reality itself. And once we have a society that is technologically developed, and once we have a society that has explored freedom to its limit, why not jump to the next stage, which is to think about freedom actually in contradiction to reality, to truth, and to political truth in particular.
And there seems to be a connection between the emergence of this idea or this sort of new understanding of freedom with what I guess we could call sort of the very performative element of American politics and life that you spend a lot of time talking about in the book. You're not calling it that, but that's how I sort of perceived it, that a lot of what's happening in America and a lot of how Americans act in public life has a performative quality. So where does that come from, and how do you see it sort of showing up in the current discourse and climate?
Let's take an example, the pandemic. When the pandemic started, one could think that perhaps America would take a pause, take a break from its cultural wars, from the reality television that has occupied the White House, from the constant drama, from Trump's wild imagination, from the Russiagate conspiracy, which actually showed us that this was not limited to Trump, but was being developed on the left as well. And of course, what happened in China and in Europe was something like that. We took a break from our usual political discussions and focused on the pandemic. And if you opened a Spanish, Italian, French newspaper back in March and April, it read almost like an academic journal in biology, full of curves, graphs, news about potential vaccines and about how a virus propagates or does not propagate, detailed analysis of the virus itself. Well, in America, this didn't happen. In America, what happened is that the pandemic was taken as a pretext for, again, the work of imagination to start anew. And you started to have those really extraordinary press conferences by Trump, where the virus was sort of playing a secondary role and Trump was playing the main role. But you also started to have these grand narratives, almost like movie plots. I remember how on the left, Trump was described almost as an Aztec king or Mayan king, leading Americans to the sacrifice of their own lives for the sake of the gods of the economy. There were these kind of narratives on both sides being developed, and it all became, in a way, a disaster movie, not just a disaster, which is how we would describe what happened in Europe and China, but the natural effect of the pandemic was reinterpreted in a way that made sense of human action, human choices, human drama. That's exactly what happens in the disaster movie, right? I've watched quite a number of them, some of the classics over the past 2 or 3 months. There's always something in the background. Sometimes it's not even clear what it is, what the threat is. And then it's all about the human drama happening on top of it, almost as if the earthquake or solar combustion or a magnetic field, the virus is just providing a pretext for the human action. And remarkably, I think that's what happened in America. You see that imagination has very few limits, and even the virus was not enough to break through this.
But so let's actually stick with the pandemic. I was going to ask about it anyway as an example, because I do think that it presents somewhat of a complication, at least to your argument, which is that if we accept this sort of theory that what essentially America is doing, and maybe especially here the Trump administration is doing, is performing a disaster movie that's untouched by reality. I mean, to stick with the metaphor, the ratings of the movie are horrible. Right? So reality is interfering, and you can sort of perform the virus into the background, but it's still there, and it still means that people are dying. So isn't the fundamental sort of problem with this, with this disconnection of freedom and truth, is that it leads to very, very suboptimal outcomes in terms of quality of life, and isn't that, risking the abortion of this grand experiment that you're describing before it's really started?
Right. So I think America will have to find a solution. This is just the interim period. Eventually, a solution has to be found. And I suggest in the last few pages of the book that technology will provide a solution. Perhaps not this time around, but for the future, for the next pandemic, and particularly for climate change, one will have to develop a technological system that in a way keeps reality at bay. This can be done through different surveillance systems, biosurveillance of different kinds, which is being developed by many companies in the US. So too late for this pandemic, but not too late for the next one. Supercomputers that can develop vaccines in weeks rather than months or years. Technology usually can provide the solution to our clash with reality. And one way that America can do this is through technology in the future. In a way, creating a barrier between American life and reality outside. I suggest at the end of the book, this has been done in previous crises. There's kind of a strange parallel between what happened with the pandemic and what happened September 11th, and also with Pearl Harbor. The idea that America was busy with its own affairs, busy with its own cultural wars, busy with the American dream. But on the outside, a specific threat was mounting and growing. There was a looming threat, either the Japanese during World War II or Al-Qaeda on September 11th. And then in both cases, the solution was to develop a system and apparatus, which continues to be criticized by many people, but an apparatus of surveillance and control, military intelligence, the CIA and the NSA back after Second World War, and then, of course, counterterrorism after September 11th. And I suspect this is sort of a bold prediction that I make at the end of the book, that in the end, America will develop a similar system for different kinds of bio threats, pandemics, but also, of course, climate change, which is going to be similar in many respects to what we're seeing now.
Mm. So I do want to, before we move on maybe to the global ramifications of what you're describing, I still want to kind of push back a little bit. So what convinces me about your argument is that in a way, this is always what America has been about. And one could even argue that, if you live in Portland, Oregon, or versus where you live in rural America, you've always lived not just in different communities, you've essentially lived in different imagined realities. And you can sort of pretend that the society that you lived in had certain aspects that weren't necessarily reflected in the rest of the country. So I see that what I'm still grasping to understand is that the current situation in America, and you've referred to it yourself a couple of times now as culture wars, still is radically different from sort of this matrix-like situation that you just described. So we're not in a situation where we have an American society where everybody gets to imagine their own reality or their own fantasy and gets to live in that, and people kind of are accepting of that of one another. You have a reality where there's two realities, probably not too many more. There's two fundamental blocks, and they spend enormous amounts of time and energy and resources and money trying to convince the other side that their reality is true. So that does not feel, at the very least to me, like a sustainable system. And again, it feels like also like a fundamentally inefficient system, because a lot of resources are being devoted to sort of convincing somebody else that their reality isn't the correct reality, which is somewhat different from abandoning the concept of reality altogether, right?
Right, but what we see today in America is this drive to create alternate realities, and I really don't think this is limited to Trump. We saw that in sort of Democratic establishment, the way it pursued both the impeachment and the Russia Gate. I think we see that in the radical left, in the woke left, which is just as performative as Trump is performative. The way I would define wokeness is precisely as a sort of a performative left, where more important than changing social reality is creating the drama of caring about social problems and do that in a very public way. So I think that's actually structurally similar to Trump. Mm-hmm. And what I do in the book is actually, I think this is maybe one of the most interesting things in the book, certainly one I spend most time on. If you go back to American history, you see this everywhere. Let me just give you 2 or 3 very quick examples. You could see it at the very period of the founding in the 17th century, the Mayflower, the Pilgrims, because in a way, what they were doing was escaping social reality back in the British Isles and creating a new world. Now, many people stayed in the British Isles and over the next 2 centuries succeeded in changing social reality, creating a society with opportunities for all and a society with religious freedom. But what the Pilgrims did when they went to America and the aristocrats in the South and Virginia was actually to give up on the project of changing social reality back home and create a completely new reality in an empty new place in the 13 colonies. Now, if you move forward in time, why was there no socialism in America, no communism in America? Very clearly because the Wild West offered the opportunity to create life anew. And even those that didn't left the East, at least they thought that they could, if things became too difficult, if life became too difficult, you could live at any time and create a new life. So this idea of leaving reality behind, be it the British Isles or the difficult conditions in the factories in New England, this idea of leaving reality behind and creating an imaginary world was there from the start, from the beginning of the 17th century. And that, in a way, actually comes to full fruition in things like Las Vegas and Disneyland or Hollywood. I say in the book that the cowboy was a flight from reality even before it became a Hollywood image, because the cowboy was essentially the proletarian that didn't want to be a proletarian back in the East and moved to the West in order to be his own man or his own woman. That's so fundamental to American life that I don't think we can understand it without reference to that. And if we take that as our background, Trump will appear in very different lights.
Let me ask you before I want to ask one last question about sort of domestic US as politics, if you want, and how that fits into your argument. Because right now, the polls suggest, although it's very early and we've learned 2016 the hard way that we shouldn't trust polls at all, but still, there's a decent chance, you said to yourself before, that Joe Biden will win the presidency in November. And he does not seem like a person who embodies any of the things that you've mentioned. If anything, he doesn't strike me as somebody who's politically adventurous in the way that, sort of you described this new tendency. He doesn't strike me as somebody who wants to leave reality behind. He is campaigning on the very idea of going back to the thing that perhaps there was before. So how does a Biden win fit into your argument? Is he just an aberration and, there's going to be somebody replacing him that is more Trumpian in style in 4 years or earlier?
Right. Well, here's my view, and we'll know pretty soon whether things happen this way or not. But Biden does represent a certain vision of political reality where it can be turned on and off. What Biden is saying is that basically we can turn off the Trump show. He's not, as opposed to people like Elizabeth Warren, advocating a project of social transformation. He's basically saying, let's turn off this Trump show. He doesn't offer anything else. And that's, I think, where the question becomes interesting, because it's very difficult to think of Biden as anything but a transitional figure. Now, we'll see the role that Kamala Harris plays in his administration and that the woke left plays. And certainly it's possible. I don't think this is a Trumpian line that the Biden administration would be in some ways hijacked by ideas that he hasn't particularly defended, but they are more powerful ideas right now. Or then it's entirely possible that the Biden administration would last for 4 years, where essentially the remnants of Trumpism would be removed. But we still would need something for the future. It does look that the Democratic Party will, one way or another, embrace these new ideas that are so powerful and so plausible in many respects, coming from the far left. And then, of course, we will have a post-Trumpian figure on the right in the Republican Party, which we still have to see who it will be, but also bringing back, I think, this idea of a virtual nationalism, of a nationalist policy that is never quite instantiated in reality, but that still appeals to many Americans. So I do think, Biden is a transitional figure fundamentally, and his idea that Trump is almost a form of virtual reality that can be turned off very easily just by electing someone different doesn't contradict what I am arguing. I think in a way it represents just a transition to a new kind of narrative that will come after.
Let's maybe turn for the remainder of our time here to the global dimensions of this development that you're seeing and that you're describing. Not too long ago in a conversation, I think it was maybe 3 years ago, you were also asked where you saw the main challenge to Western liberalism come from, and you answered that it would probably be China. Whereas now it seems, that you're actually arguing that it may end up being the US. So I know that you've actually lived in China in between at some point. So what made you change your mind? Why is that big new thing that you're describing and sort of arguing for its inevitability, I guess, not coming from China after all?
Well, all my books are books about the future, about what comes after, what we have now, or what we've had for the past, I would say the past 2 or 3 centuries, because liberalism has been dominant for that long. So I'm very interested. I've always been interested in trying to see what comes after, because I don't believe for a moment that this is the end. And different books have been exploring different possibilities. So I explain in the preface to this new book that obviously the most instinctive and natural way to think about this is, well, the West is liberal and is committed to liberalism. And if a threat comes from the outside, it will come from China, but it won't come from the West itself. So I explored that possibility in my previous 2 books. Already it seemed to me that China by itself was sufficient to make the case that we're not really at the end, that we are at the beginning. I got recently very interested in India, which I think may actually issue a challenge to liberalism that's more powerful than the Chinese challenge. But then, of course, it became clear, as I thought more and more about this, that I myself, but we have been neglecting a kind of more dramatic possibility that the West itself would increasingly be unhappy with the solutions from the past. And that's not very clear or obvious in Europe, but I think it is clear and obvious in the United States. People talk about a successor ideology, referring to the far left. Trump in himself is already something that could not have been anticipated 10 years ago. And in the next book, I'll explore another possibility that I think has been neglected. I don't want to be too outspoken about it yet. But essentially, my project has been to look everywhere for what one could call the germs of a new society that will come after the society that we know and that we understand.
So let's assume America moves into the direction further that you describe, and of course, right now, the thing that keeps a lot of people up at night and a lot of people worry about is the US-China conflict. So is a new United States detached from reality and living, in a fantasy or in multiple fantasy, as you're describing it, more or less likely to enter a full-scale military conflict with China than a quote-unquote European liberalist United States as we maybe have had it before? So will the change that you see make this confrontation worse or better in the long run?
In principle, it would be worse. Already with neoconservatism, let us say with the Iraq War, we had this sort of the worst side of this fantasy politics that I'm describing. Because essentially the Iraq War, I discussed this in the book at some length, was a form of fantasy politics. But of a very simple, elementary kind. I think the ideologues behind the Iraq invasion essentially thought about world politics as a kind of children's tale. You go out into the world, you defeat the villain, and you come back home covered in glory. I mean, it's extraordinary, but there wasn't much else. If you read the papers, the private communications back then in 2002, 2003, this is how they thought about the Iraq War. So I think this shows the perversion of the way of thinking that I'm describing. But the way of thinking I'm describing, just like liberalism, is not a monolith. It also evolves. And so I think we're in the process of evolving a way of fantasy politics that does not collapse immediately. Because, a fantasy world may be poorly built and then it will collapse as it collapsed in Iraq, or it may be well built and then it could last and it could actually be a world that people prefer to reality itself. So I think we're in a dangerous moment, certainly a dangerous period, and some of the American reactions to China's challenge are troubling in the sense that they show a complete divorce from reality. China's reactions are troubling in a way for the opposite reason, because they are materialistic, because they are based just on the facts of power, of brute power, of technological power. America's reactions are very different, but in some cases, one does feel the compulsion to ask American strategists to come back to the real world. I just don't think that's possible anymore. But certainly this break from reality creates an enormous challenge, both in American domestic politics and its foreign policy as well.
So maybe as a very last point, we have not really discussed Europe. Let's spend 2 more minutes on that. So what is Europe's role ideally from your point of view, facing a United States that is sort of drifting off into fantasy, and a China that, I don't actually know what China's sort of, how to describe China's system, but I guess a China that is becoming at the very least more assertive and is also advancing in a way its version of a truth and of a reality. Does Europe have to evolve in a way as well, or is there a space for kind of Europe continuing on its path of enlightenment and liberalism?
Europe will eventually have to evolve. The world is changing very fast and we're still hanging on to the belief that it doesn't have to change. But having said that, I do think that the immediate goal and purpose for European politicians is to preserve what we have. Europeans want to live in the kind of society we have in Europe. The world is becoming very dangerous around us. It's not just China, it's not just Russia. I think it's America itself that increasingly is looking like a place that we don't fully understand. And so the immediate task has to be making sure that the world as we know it and the life that we want to live in Europe is still possible. And so I do agree with those politicians in Europe, including Macron, that see a certain need for a policy of protection. That must be the immediate plan for the next 10, 15, 20 years. Then, of course, is a question whether this is sustainable in the long term. I think it's the immediate necessity, the immediate need for Europeans, but then we'll have to see also how we can make our societies better and how we can embrace the possibilities of the future, because it's certainly not possible. I compared recently the situation in Europe to Austria in the 19th century. The whole world was changing around it, but Austria in the first half of the 19th century, after the Napoleonic Wars, was essentially hanging on to the past. It created, of course, 2 or 3 decades of enormous possibilities for human life. And I guess people asked around Europeans of the upper classes in the 19th century, many would have picked Vienna as the place to live. But is that sustainable in the long term when the world is changing so quickly? And in particular, we don't have time to talk about that now, but particularly technology. We still in Europe don't have a way to think about how to embrace technology. And unfortunately, both China and the United States have their mental constructs that allow them to embrace technology for different reasons, but they have those mental constructs. And we in Europe don't have it. And that, I think, is going to become a problem because we're going to fall behind in the technological race.
All right, Bruno Maçaes, thank you very, very much for joining us. We're at the end of this part of the conversation. Thank you all for having joined us. I should mention that if you want more Bruno, first of all, go out and buy the book. But also secondly, if you're in Switzerland, he's coming our way in a few weeks to speak at the retail conference at GDI. So if you do want to hear him, I think this is going to be focused on the Belt and Road. So that's coming up as well. And he also is a prolific webcast speaker right now. There's a few really good recordings as well out there that you can go and listen to if you want to expand on the argument. For now, thank you again. And for those of you who signed up for the Q&A, see you over in the Q&A in just a few seconds. Thank you very much and have a wonderful evening.